A grandmother murdered all her grandchildren to steal the throne, but one baby boy was hidden in the temple for 6 years. Let me tell you about the boy who survived genocide to become king at 7 years old. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I want to tell you one of the most dramatic survival stories in the Bible. It's the story of Joash, a baby prince who was rescued from a massacre, hidden in the temple for 6 years, and then crowned king as a young child. This is a story about evil, courage, faith, and how God preserves his purposes even when everything seems lost. It involves palace intrigue, a murderous grandmother, a brave aunt, a courageous priest, and a child king who would change the course of a nation. Let me take you through what happened. To understand this story, we need to know the background of the royal family. This takes place in the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom, after Israel split into two. The northern kingdom was called Israel, and the southern kingdom was called Judah. Judah was supposed to be the faithful kingdom, the one that maintained the line of David and worshipped God in Jerusalem. But by this time, Judah had fallen into terrible sin. King Jehoshaphat had been a mostly good king who sought the Lord, but he made a fatal mistake in trying to create a political alliance. He arranged for his son Joram to marry Athaliah, the daughter of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel of Israel. If those names sound familiar, they should. Ahab and Jezebel were the most wicked rulers in Israel's history. They promoted Baal worship, killed God's prophets, and led Israel into deep idolatry. Their daughter Athaliah brought that same evil into Judah. When Joram became king of Judah, he murdered all his brothers to secure his throne. The influence of his wife Athaliah was clear. He led Judah into Baal worship and built high places for idol worship. God sent prophets to warn him, but Joram refused to listen. He reigned for 8 years and died of a painful disease. The Bible says he passed away to no one's regret. Nobody mourned him. His son Ahaziah became king next. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned only 1 year. His mother Athaliah was his counselor and encouraged him to do wrong. He followed the evil ways of Ahab's family. During his brief reign, Ahaziah went to visit his uncle, King Joram of Israel. While he was there, a prophet named Elisha anointed a commander, Jehu, to destroy the house of Ahab. Jehu carried out God's judgment. He killed King Joram of Israel. He had Jezebel thrown from a window to her death. And he killed Ahaziah king of Judah as well. So Ahaziah died after reigning only 1 year. His body was brought back to Jerusalem and buried with his ancestors. Now, normally when a king died, one of his sons would become the next king. Ahaziah had sons, he had heirs. The royal line of David should have continued. But Ahaziah's mother Athaliah had other plans. When Athaliah saw that her son was dead, she proceeded to destroy the whole royal family. Read that again. A grandmother murdered her own grandchildren, all of them. She wanted the throne for herself, and she was willing to kill her own family to get it. This was unprecedented evil. Athaliah gathered all the male heirs of the house of David and had them executed. Babies, young children, teenagers, all killed. The line of David, through which the Messiah was supposed to come, was being wiped out. If Athaliah succeeded, there would be no more kings from David's line. God's promise to David that his throne would be established forever would fail. Satan was behind this. If the line of David was eliminated, the Messiah couldn't come. This was an attack not just on Judah, but on God's plan of salvation for the world. But God had a plan. There was one person in the palace who refused to let this happen. Her name was Jehosheba. Jehosheba was Ahaziah's sister, which made her Athaliah's daughter. She was also married to a priest named Jehoiada. When Jehosheba saw what her mother was doing, she made a split-second decision. She took Joash, son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the royal princes who were about to be murdered. She put him and his nurse in a bedroom. The Bible says she hid him from Athaliah, so he was not killed. Can you imagine this scene? The palace in chaos. Soldiers going room to room, killing children. And Jehosheba, moving quickly, grabs one baby and his nurse and hides them. Maybe she hid them in a storage room, or a servant's quarters, or some forgotten corner of the palace. However she did it, she saved baby Joash. Then, when the opportunity came, Jehosheba smuggled the baby and his nurse out of the palace. Where could she take him? Where could she hide a baby that no one would think to look? She took him to the temple. Her husband Jehoiada was a priest, one of the chief priests in the temple. They had access to the temple complex, including living quarters and storage rooms. For 6 years, Joash remained hidden in the temple of the Lord, while Athaliah ruled the land. For 6 years, Athaliah thought she had succeeded. She believed all the heirs were dead. She had the throne. She promoted Baal worship throughout Judah. She let the temple of the Lord fall into disrepair while building temples to Baal. She raided the temple treasury to fund her idol worship. The nation that was supposed to worship the one true God was now under the rule of a murderous queen who worshipped Baal. But hidden in that very temple was a secret, a little boy growing up. The true king of Judah, the heir of David. Jehosheba and Jehoiada raised him, taught him, and prepared him. Nobody knew except them, and perhaps a very small circle of trusted servants. For 6 years they kept the secret. For 6 years they waited for God's timing. Can you imagine the courage that took? Every day, the risk of being discovered. Every day, the danger that someone might see the boy and recognize him as a prince. If Athaliah found out, she would kill Joash and everyone who helped hide him. But Jehosheba and Jehoiada trusted God. They believed God would preserve the line of David, and they were willing to risk their lives to protect this child. In the 7th year, Jehoiada decided it was time to act. Joash was now 7 years old enough to be presented as king, old enough for the people to recognize him as legitimate. Jehoiada knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed military support. He needed the commanders of the army on his side. So Jehoiada made a covenant with the commanders of units of 100. These were the leaders of the royal guard and the palace guards. He brought them into the temple and showed them the king's son. Imagine their shock. They thought all the heirs were dead. Athaliah had been ruling for 6 years, and now this priest shows them a 7-year-old boy and says, "This is your king, the true heir of David. He's been hidden here in the temple all this time." Jehoiada swore them to secrecy and then gave them detailed instructions. He divided them into groups. One group would be on duty at the palace, another at the surgate, another at the gate behind the guard. They would guard the temple from all sides. Jehoiada commanded them, "Station yourselves around the king, each of you with weapon in hand. Anyone who approaches your ranks is to be put to death. Stay close to the king wherever he goes." This was going to be a coup, but it was a righteous coup, restoring the legitimate king to the throne. The commanders did as Jehoiada ordered. Each one took his men, those who were going on duty on the Sabbath, and those who were going off duty, and came to Jehoiada the priest. Jehoiada gave the commanders the spears and shields that had belonged to King David and that were in the temple. These were ceremonial weapons, symbols of David's kingship. By giving them to the guards, Jehoiada was making a statement. We are restoring David's throne. The guards stationed themselves around the temple, each with weapon in hand, surrounding the king. Then Jehoiada brought out the king's son. He put the crown on him and presented him with a copy of the covenant. They proclaimed him king and anointed him. The people clapped their hands and shouted, "Long live the king!" For the first time in 6 years, Joash stood in public. A 7-year-old boy wearing a crown. The true king of Judah. The noise of the celebration reached Athaliah's ears. She heard the guards and the people shouting and celebrating. She came to the temple to see what was happening, and she saw the king standing by the pillar, as the custom was. The officers and the trumpeters were beside the king, and all the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets. Athaliah tore her robes and screamed, "Treason! Treason!" But it was too late. Jehoiada commanded the commanders, "Bring her out between the ranks and put to the sword anyone who follows her." For the priest had said, "She must not be put to death in the temple of the Lord." So they seized her as she reached the place where the horses enter the palace grounds, and there she was put to death. The murderous queen, who had killed her own grandchildren and ruled through terror, was executed. Justice was done, the usurper was removed, and the rightful king, though only 7 years old, was on the throne. Jehoiada then made a covenant between the Lord and the king and people that they would be the Lord's people. He also made a covenant between the king and the people. The people's response was immediate. They went to the temple of Baal and tore it down. They smashed the altars and idols to pieces. They killed Matan, the priest of Baal, in front of the altars. 6 years of Baal worship was being undone. The nation was returning to the worship of the true God. Jehoiada posted guards at the temple of the Lord to ensure its protection. Then he took the commanders, the guards, and all the people of the land, and together they brought the young king down from the temple. They went into the palace by way of the gate of the guards and seated the king on the royal throne. All the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was calm, because Athaliah had been put to death. Joash was 7 years old when he became king. Think about that for a moment. 7 years old. Most 7-year-olds are learning to read and playing with friends. Joash was running a nation. Of course, he had help. Jehoiada the priest essentially served as regent, guiding the young king and making major decisions. But the biblical record makes it clear that as long as Jehoiada instructed him, Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. 4 years. The combination worked well. Joash had the legitimacy and authority of being the king. Jehoiada had the wisdom and experience to guide him. Together, they led Judah in a spiritual reformation. One of Joash's major projects was to repair the temple. Remember, Athaliah had let it fall into terrible disrepair. She had even broken into the temple and used its sacred objects for Baal worship. The temple needed extensive repairs. Joash came up with a plan. He told the priests to collect all the money that was brought as sacred offerings to the temple. This included the census tax, money from personal vows, and freewill offerings. The priests were supposed to use this money to repair whatever damage was found in the temple. But years passed, and the repairs weren't being done. By the 23rd year of Joash's reign, the temple still hadn't been repaired. So King Joash summoned Jehoiada and the other priests. He asked them, "Why aren't you repairing the damage done to the temple? Take no more money from your treasurers, but hand it over for repairing the temple." The priests agreed not to collect any more money from the people and not to repair the temple themselves. Instead, Jehoiada came up with a new system. He took a chest and bored a hole in its lid. He placed it beside the altar, on the right side, as one enters the temple of the Lord. The priests who guarded the entrance put into the chest all the money that was brought to the temple. Whenever they saw that there was a large amount of money in the chest, the royal secretary and the high priest came. They counted the money that had been brought into the temple and put it into bags. When the amount was determined, they gave the money to the men appointed to supervise the work on the temple. These men paid the workers, the carpenters, the builders, the masons, and the stonecutters. They purchased timber and blocks of dressed stone for the repair of the temple. They also paid all the other expenses of restoring the temple. The system worked. The money was used honestly and efficiently. The Bible says they did not require an accounting from those to whom they gave the money to pay the workers, because they acted with complete honesty. The temple was repaired and restored. The house of God was beautiful again. This was Joash's finest moment. A king who had been saved from death as a baby, hidden in the temple, now restoring that very temple. It's a beautiful picture of gratitude and faithfulness. As long as Jehoiada lived, Joash did well. The priest who had saved his life, raised him, and guided him was a stabilizing influence. Jehoiada lived to be 130 years old. He was buried with the kings in the city of David because of all the good he had done in Israel for God. and his temple. That's an incredible honor. Jehoiada wasn't a king, but he was buried like one because of his service to God and to the nation. But after Jehoiada died, everything changed. The officials of Judah came to King Joash and paid him homage, and the king listened to them. These officials convinced Joash to abandon the temple of the Lord and worship Asherah poles and idols instead. The same king who had repaired the temple now abandoned it. Why did Joash do this? The Bible suggests he was easily influenced. As long as Jehoiada was there to guide him, Joash did what was right. But when Jehoiada died, Joash had no moral anchor. He listened to whoever had his ear at the moment, and the officials who flattered him led him astray. God sent prophets to bring Judah back to him, but the people would not listen. Then the Spirit of God came on Zechariah, son of Jehoiada the priest. Zechariah stood before the people and said, "This is what God says. Why do you disobey the Lord's commands? You will not prosper, because you have forsaken the Lord. He has forsaken you." Notice who Zechariah was. He was the son of Jehoiada, the priest who had saved Joash's life. Zechariah was probably like a brother to Joash, having grown up with him in the temple. But the officials plotted against Zechariah, and by order of the king, they stoned him to death in the courtyard of the Lord's temple. King Joash did not remember the kindness Zechariah's father, Jehoiada, had shown him. Instead, he killed Jehoiada's son. As Zechariah was dying, he said, "May the Lord see this and call you to account." This is one of the most shocking betrayals in the Bible. Jehoiada saved Joash's life as a baby, raised him, guided him, made him king. And Joash repaid that kindness by murdering Jehoiada's son. The consequences were swift. At the turn of the year, the army of Aram marched against Joash. They invaded Judah and Jerusalem and killed all the leaders of the people. They sent all the plunder to their king in Damascus. Although the Aramean army had come with only a few men, the Lord delivered into their hands a much larger army. Because Judah had forsaken the Lord, the God of their ancestors, judgment was carried out on Joash. When the Arameans withdrew, they left Joash severely wounded. His own officials conspired against him for murdering the son of Jehoiada the priest. They killed him in his bed, so he died. The boy who had survived a massacre, who had been hidden and protected, who had been crowned king at 7, who had restored the temple, ended his life in disgrace. Murdered by his own officials, he was buried in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. Even in death, he was dishonored. So what do we learn from the tragic story of Joash? First, God is faithful to his promises. God had promised David that his throne would be established forever. When Athaliah tried to wipe out David's line, God preserved one baby. The line continued, and eventually, Jesus the Messiah came from that line. Satan's attempt to prevent the Messiah failed. Second, God uses ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary purposes. Jehosheba was just a woman in the palace, but her courage to grab one baby and hide him changed the course of history. Never underestimate what God can do through one act of courage. Third, godly mentorship matters. As long as Jehoiada lived and guided Joash, the king did well. When that influence was removed, Joash fell away. We all need people who will guide us, challenge us, and hold us accountable. Fourth, a good start doesn't guarantee a good finish. Joash had an incredible beginning. He was miraculously saved, became king as a child, and restored the temple. But he ended in tragedy. How we finish matters more than how we start. Fifth, gratitude is essential. Joash forgot what Jehoiada had done for him. He forgot that he owed his very life to this priest's family. That ingratitude led to murder and his own downfall. We must never forget what God and others have done for us. Sixth, surrounding yourself with the right people is crucial. When Joash listened to Jehoiada, he thrived. When he listened to corrupt officials, he fell. The voices you allow to influence, you will shape your life. Finally, evil never wins in the end. Athaliah thought she had won. She killed all the heirs and ruled for 6 years, but God's plan couldn't be stopped. The rightful king was hidden, preserved, and eventually restored. No matter how dark things look, God is still in control. Now, let's talk about Jehosheba, because her role deserves more attention. The Bible doesn't tell us much about her, but what it does tell us is remarkable. She was the daughter of King Joram and the sister of King Ahaziah. That means Athaliah was her mother. Think about the moral courage that required. Her own mother was committing genocide against the royal family. Her own mother was murdering Jehosheba's nephews, and Jehosheba had to make a choice. Would she stay loyal to her mother, or would she do what was right? She chose righteousness over family loyalty. She chose to save a life rather than participate in murder through her silence. This wasn't a safe choice. If her mother discovered what she had done, Jehosheba would likely be executed too. She was risking her own life to save her nephew. We don't know what motivated her. Maybe she still worshipped the God of Israel, despite her mother's influence. Maybe she remembered the covenant God made with David. Maybe she simply couldn't stomach the murder of innocent children. Whatever her motivation, she acted. And that action changed everything. It's also significant that Jehosheba was married to Jehoiada the priest. This marriage between a royal daughter and the priest created a unique situation. Jehosheba had access to the palace because of her royal birth. She had access to the temple because of her marriage to a priest. This put her in the perfect position to move between both worlds. She could grab the baby from the palace and hide him in the temple. God's providence is evident in this marriage. It wasn't an accident that the woman who would save the heir to David's throne was married to one of the chief priests. God was positioning his people exactly where they needed to be. Now let's talk about what those 6 years in hiding must have been like. The Bible doesn't give us details, but we can imagine. Joash would have grown up surrounded by the temple. His earliest memories would be of worship, sacrifice, and the presence of God. He would have heard the priests singing psalms. He would have seen the morning and evening sacrifices. He would have learned about the covenant God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He would have been taught about his ancestor David, and God has promised to establish David's throne forever. Jehoiada and Jehosheba would have educated him just in reading and writing, but in the law of God, they would have prepared him to be a king who honored the Lord. In a sense, the temple was the perfect school for a future king. He wasn't learning palace politics and military strategy. He was learning about God, worship, and righteousness. When Joash finally became king at age 7, he had a foundation that most kings never had. But there was also a downside to this upbringing. Joash grew up in isolation. He didn't have normal social development. He didn't learn to interact with peers. He didn't develop the ability to discern people's motives. This made him vulnerable to manipulation later in life. When Jehoiada died and the officials came to flatter him, Joash didn't have the discernment to see through them. He had been protected his whole life, first hidden in the temple, then guided by Jehoiada. He never learned to stand on his own. This is an important lesson about leadership development. Protection is important, especially in the early years. But at some point, leaders need to learn to make decisions, resist bad counsel, and stand firm under pressure. Joash never fully developed those skills. Let's also consider the risk Jehoiada took in revealing Joash to 6 years. He had kept this secret for 6 years. He could have kept it longer. Why reveal it when he did? Joash was 7 years old enough to be presented as king, but still very young. Some might argue Jehoiada should have waited until Joash was older, more mature, more able to rule. But I think Jehoiada understood something important. He understood timing. He understood that Athaliah's evil reign needed to end. He understood that every year she ruled, she pulled Judah deeper into Baal worship. The temple was falling apart. The covenant was being forgotten. The longer he waited, the harder it would be to restore true worship. So Jehoiada acted when he did, because it was the right time. not the easy time. He had the support of the military commanders, he had a plan, and he had faith that God would protect the young king. The coronation of Joash must have been an incredible moment. Imagine being one of the people there that day. You've lived under Athaliah's oppressive rule for 6 years. You've watched Baal worship spread. You've seen the temple neglected. You've wondered if God has abandoned his people. Then you hear noise coming from the temple. You go to investigate, and you see a 7-year-old boy wearing a crown, surrounded by guards. The priest is proclaiming him as the king, the son of Uzziah, the heir of David, a boy you didn't even know existed. A boy who has been hidden in the temple all this time. The shock and joy must have been overwhelming. This wasn't just a political change. This was a sign that God had not abandoned his covenant, that God had preserved David's line, that God was still faithful. The people's response was immediate and enthusiastic. They didn't question whether a 7-year-old could be king. They saw this as God's deliverance. And they celebrated. "Long live the king," they shouted. After 6 years of tyranny, hope had returned. Athaliah's reaction is telling. When she heard the noise and came to see what was happening, she immediately recognized the threat. She tore her robes and screamed, "Treason! Treason!" But it wasn't treason. Joash was the legitimate king. Athaliah was the usurper. She had no legal claim to the throne. She had seized power through murder. Now that power was being taken from her, and she knew it. Her cry of treason was the desperate scream of someone who had been exposed. She had no support. No one came to her defense. The commanders followed Jehoiada's orders and removed her from power. Justice was finally done. The destruction of Baal's temple that followed was significant. The people didn't just abandon Baal worship, they actively destroyed it. They tore down the temple, smashed the altars and idols, and killed Baal's priest. This was a complete rejection of everything Athaliah had brought into Judah. It was a national return to the worship of the true God, and it was led by a 7-year-old king. The temple repairs that Joash later initiated are also worth examining more closely. The temple had been neglected and damaged for years. Athaliah had even broken into it and used sacred objects for Baal worship. Fixing it required significant resources and organization. Joash's first plan was to have the priests collect offerings and use them for repairs, but this didn't work. After 23 years, the repairs still weren't done. Why not? The Bible doesn't say explicitly, but it seems the priests were using the money for other purposes. Maybe they were using it for their own support. Maybe they were using it for general temple operations. But whatever the reason, the repairs weren't happening. Joash could have gotten angry and punished the priests. Instead, he came up with a new system, a chest with a hole in the lid, placed where people could drop money directly. The money was counted publicly and given directly to the workers. This created transparency and accountability. It removed the temptation for the priests to divert the funds, and it worked. The temple was repaired. This shows Joash's administrative wisdom, at least during this period of his life. He identified a problem, created a solution, and saw it through. He didn't just complain about the temple's condition, he did something about it. This is the kind of practical leadership that made his early reign successful. The tragedy of Joash's later life is even more painful when we consider what he had. He had been miraculously saved as a baby. He had been raised by a godly priest. He had been taught God's law. He had restored the temple. He had everything he needed to be a great king. But when Jehoiada died, Joash lost his moral compass. The officials who came to pay him homage and lead him astray were likely the same kind of people who had served under Athaliah. They had learned to survive by flattery and manipulation. They probably told Joash what he wanted to hear. They probably made him feel powerful and important. And Joash, lacking discernment, believed them. The abandonment of the temple that Joash had repaired is especially tragic. All that work, all those resources, all that effort to restore God's house. And then Joash turned his back on it. He allowed worship of Asherah poles and idols instead. It's a heartbreaking reversal. God's response was to send prophets. God didn't give up on Joash immediately. He sent messengers to call him back. But Joash and the people refused to listen. Then God sent Zechariah, Jehoiada's son. Zechariah's message was direct. You have forsaken the Lord, so he has forsaken you. This was a prophetic word of judgment. But instead of repenting, Joash had Zechariah killed. The method of execution makes it even worse. They stoned him in the courtyard of the Lord's temple. The same temple where Joash had been hidden as a baby. The same temple Joash had repaired. Now it was the site of a prophet's murder. And not just any prophet, but the son of the man who saved Joash's life. Zechariah's dying words are haunting. May the Lord see this and call you to account. It was both a prayer and a prophecy, and it was fulfilled quickly. Within a year, the Aramean army invaded. They defeated Judah's much larger army with just a small force. This was clearly divine judgment. Judah's military strength meant nothing when God withdrew his protection. The Arameans killed the leaders and plundered the nation. When they left, Joash was severely wounded. And then his own officials, remembering that Joash had killed Zechariah, conspired against him. They murdered him in his own bed. The boy who had been saved from assassination as a baby died by assassination as an adult. The king who had been crowned with honor was buried without honor, not in the royal tombs. It's a complete reversal of fortune, and it all came from a failure to remember. Joash forgot what God had done for him. He forgot that his very life was a miracle. He forgot the kindness of Jehoiada and Jehosheba. He forgot the covenant God made with David. And that forgetfulness led to his destruction. This is why the Bible repeatedly commands God's people to remember. Remember what God has done. Remember his faithfulness. Remember his commands. Because when we forget, we fall. The story of Joash is ultimately a warning. It warns us that a good start is not enough. It warns us that being in the right place at the right time is not enough. It warns us that past blessings don't guarantee future faithfulness. It warns us to finish well. Because how we finish is what matters most. Thanks again for watching. If you made it this far, you're clearly interested in these deep biblical stories. Make sure you're subscribed so you catch the next one. Leave a comment and let me know what other biblical stories you'd like to hear. I'll see you next time.